Welcome to our discussion on the debt ceiling. It's this legal borrowing cap set for the US government, kind of like a gigantic credit card limit.
Yep, right. So it's like the government can't just borrow endlessly without some form of oversight, correct?
Exactly. The debt ceiling puts a hard cap on how much money the government can borrow to meet its obligations. It isn't about funding new projects per se, but rather it's about paying for things it already committed to, like Social Security, Medicare benefits, military salaries, even interest on the national debt.
Oh, I see. So it's more like a limit that forces fiscal discipline, kind of similar to keeping your household budget in check.
Yes, it's exactly that. On a much larger and more critical scale, think of it, it's like using a credit card where you can't spend more than a set limit to make sure you pay your bills on time.
Right. So, based on this, the government essentially issues treasury bonds, notes, and bills to cover any shortfalls if its revenues fall short, correct?
Absolutely. The government relies on issuing those securities to meet spending commitments, and if it ever hits the ceiling, there's a real risk of not being able to borrow more funds, which can lead to what we call a debt ceiling crisis.
Yep. And that crisis, it's not just some abstract issue, is it? It has actual consequences for everyone, right?
Right, you are. A debt ceiling crisis can lead to default. I mean, imagine if, due to hitting this borrowing limit, the government couldn't pay interest, salaries, social benefits, things that directly impact people's lives.
Yeah, that sounds quite severe. Would that also impact global markets?
Definitely. US Treasury securities have long been seen as one of the safest investments in the world. So if there's even a hint of default, investor confidence could plummet globally.
Right. It's kind of like if a major credit card issuer suddenly couldn't honor its payments, it would ripple out into the whole financial system.
Exactly. And let's not forget, if the government can't borrow more due to the ceiling, it might have to slow down or even shut down parts of its operations. That can lead to a partial government shutdown, affecting public services and even job stability in some areas.
Okay, so what's the historical context for all this? How did we end up with this kind of setup?
Great question. The debt ceiling was actually instituted back in 1917 during World War I. Prior to that, Congress would approve each borrowing instance individually.
Yeah.
It was a move to allow more flexibility during times of national emergency, like war, so the government didn't have to go through endless approvals for every debt issue.
That's interesting. So the idea was to give the government the agility to meet financial demands quickly, especially during crises.
Absolutely, though over time, as the nation's financial needs grew, factoring in things like inflation, population growth, bigger government programs, the ceiling was raised repeatedly. It's a reflection of the government's expanding obligations.
But isn't it a bit counterintuitive? I mean, setting a limit only to keep raising it later, does that really ensure fiscal discipline?
That's a really good point. Some critics argue that the constant raising of the ceiling is more of a political tool than a strict fiscal constraint. They say it's like having a speed limit that you continually push to justify ever higher spending without addressing underlying budget issues.
I get that, but surely there must be a delicate balancing act, right? On one hand, you need this flexibility, but on the other, you risk inciting a crisis if policy doesn't keep up with financial reality?
Exactly. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. When Congress debates raising the debt ceiling, it's not just a mechanical financial decision. It's loaded with political drama and the potential for serious economic consequences.
And I'm guessing that these debates also have like an impact on personal finances, not just government operations.
Right again. If, for example, there's a risk in the market of a default, interest rates on mortgages, car loans, even student loans could go up. It creates a kind of financial uncertainty that touches everyone. Lower consumer confidence can reduce spending, which ripples through the economy.
Wow, so the effects are really far-reaching, from international markets all the way to day-to-day household budgets.
Exactly. It all ties back to that notion of investor confidence and overall economic stability. A shake in the government's credibility can lead to a cascade of higher borrowing costs and ultimately a slower economy.
Right. So let's say hypothetically, Congress delays raising the ceiling and the government nears default. What does the Treasury do?
Well, under those circumstances, the Treasury has to rely on incoming revenues to keep the government running. This means it might have to prioritize which payments get made, potentially delaying things like salaries or even interest payments on the debt.
And that has, the potential to destabilize financial markets, right?
Absolutely. A default or even a near default scenario shakes the foundation. It's why these debates are so critical. They're not just about numbers, but about ensuring the government can continue to meet its obligations without causing systemic economic shocks.
I'm curious, though. Some argue that the debt ceiling itself is somewhat redundant today. Since it doesn't directly control spending, only borrowing. What's your take on that?
That's a contentious debate.
Yeah.
On one hand, the ceiling does force a moment of reflection on borrowing limits. On the other, as you mentioned, it doesn't truly constrain spending since the government can always raise the limit when needed. Critics say it becomes a recurring political ritual that distracts from deeper fiscal reform.
Right, so it might serve more as a periodic political pressure valve rather than a true check on fiscal policy.
Yep, that's exactly the argument. There's a sort of irony that while the ceiling is intended to keep government borrowing in check, its repeated increases have become almost routine, reflecting the ever-growing commitments of the federal government instead of enforcing fiscal discipline.
So, in essence, the debt ceiling is this critical, double-edged mechanism, symbolic of financial accountability, yet also vulnerable to political maneuvering and economic risks.
Absolutely, and that's what makes understanding it so vital. It's not just abstract policy, it's a real force that affects everything from government stability to everyday consumer finance.
Right. Thanks for breaking that down. It really puts into perspective how a policy tool like the debt ceiling, despite being over a century old, still plays a mighty impactful role today.
Yes, indeed. And as the economy evolves, with new challenges, rising costs, and changed global dynamics, the debate on how best to manage or even possibly reform the debt ceiling will only intensify.
It's almost like discussing an outdated piece of technology that still holds modern relevance. It baffles me sometimes how something so old remains so central to fiscal debates.
Exactly. It's like using a vintage tool in a modern workshop. It has limitations, but it still plays a crucial role. And bridging that gap between tradition and today's economic realities is what policymakers are constantly wrestling with.
Right. Well, this has been both enlightening and a bit of a roller coaster of fiscal drama. Thanks for the deep dive.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to discuss these critical issues. Remember, folks, these fiscal policies affect us all, even if they sometimes seem like abstract, distant topics. Stay informed and keep questioning it all.
Yeah.